Hello, thank you for attending our webinar, Securing Cloud Applications, CASB 2.0, the next frontier for CASB. I'm your host, Courtney Stillman, Partner Manager for Semantic at Optiv. I would like to introduce our speakers. We are honored to be joined today by experts from both Optiv and our valued strategic partner, Semantic. Nick Mendez is a cloud security specialist at Optiv. He brings over 13 years of cloud services and leadership experience to Optiv. Over his career, Nick has established himself as a trusted advisor in the PCI and HIPAA high-trust space, as well as among Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies. As a cloud security specialist, Nick will focus on providing strategic conversation around successful cloud security programs to Optiv's clients. Our second speaker is Eric Andrews. Eric has more than 25 years of marketing and executive management experience in the networking and security industry. As the VP of Cloud Security at Semantic, Eric is driving initiatives to establish Semantic as a leader in this emerging market. Eric came to Semantic through the acquisition of Elastica, where he led marketing for the CASB startup since its inception. To get things started today, I'll turn it over to Nick Mendez to provide Optiv's perspective and approach to cloud security. Nick?
Hi, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. Let me start off by saying I appreciate everyone's time today. We understand everyone's extremely busy, and we have some great content for you, so hope everybody enjoys today's conversation. So let's start by framing the conversation with some relevant cloud information from the practice group to give you a sense of what we're seeing and doing within Optiv's account base. So first up, shouldn't come without any surprise, but cloud adoption continues to rise. And this 2017 report shows that 90% are in some organizations are in some stages of adoption. Now, if you look at the bottom two portions, there's 24% that are in the planning phase or in the no plans to deploy phase. And what we're seeing within our customer base is that this holds pretty true. Reason that some organizations that are in the no plan to deploy or planning phase is that traditionally they've had some extremely sensitive data that they were a little hesitant to put in the cloud. And as we've seen the CASB market mature, we're seeing this actually decline, right? We're seeing more and more organizations trying to figure out how can they harness today's technologies and leverage the power of cloud when you're looking at SaaS applications. So as we look at the CASB deployment trends, if we were to look at this point in time last year, from an Optiv perspective, I would say you're going to see quite a bit more red than you would blue. And this holds true with our account base. We're seeing around 7% of our account base that is already deployed CASB, and really we're looking at a 24% increase in organizations that are planning to deploy CASB through the end of 2017 or have plans to deploy in 2018. And this is a dramatically different effort than what was seen this time last year. And we'll go through kind of the reasoning and what we're seeing are some of the main motivators that we're seeing this adoption rate. With anything, right, there's good and bad of the cloud. Right? The bad part is, Gartner had mentioned that by 2020, 95% of security failures are going to be on the customer side of the fence, right? And there's a reason for that, is that if you really look at two things. One is the shared responsibility model. Many organizations that are using SaaS applications in the cloud, right, they are thinking that because they're using a SaaS application that the security is going to 100% fall on the provider that they choose. And we'll go through what that model looks like in the shared responsibility model. The other item that is leading to such a high increase in security flaws is that traditional security solutions are simply not working, or they have extremely limited functionality because what they're trying to do is use what they have within a software-defined data center or an on-prem solution from a security controls and policies perspective, and trying to extend that into the public cloud. And with the limited functionality of a tool that they may be using, we're seeing that organizations can't quite replicate what they want to as they do on-prem. And so our goal as Optiv, as we work with different organizations, is to help our customers get to that 5% versus the 95%. And we'll discuss a little bit about our methodology and how we help customers think through this venture. So the biggest concerns that we see from customers are around a couple of different pillars. The number one is data loss and leakage. The biggest concern that they have is not being able to have visibility once it leaves the perimeter of their network, and not having a control over different pieces such as data privacy, confidentiality, as well as control over the data sovereignty and the regulatory compliance. And we're seeing many organizations really trying to understand and get their arms wrapped around how can they harness today's SaaS applications and being able to figure out a way to have visibility into this. And we'll discuss that here shortly as well. So on this piece here, on the SaaS shared responsibility model, for this conversation, let's zoom into the SaaS model. And the SaaS cloud adoption continues to grow because they really represent the greatest cost versus benefit with the fastest implementation times. So if you look at the top two boxes on the left that are in gray that are listed as people and data, these are going to be the responsibility of the customer and represent the majority of the risk within SaaS. So the complexity of these two areas vary from mild to extremely complex. And as SaaS applications are extremely unique, like Salesforce O365, for example, you have thousands of different ways to configure these options, and more importantly, different ways to integrate. And all of these are going to be extremely unique to each application, and they're all different in what they do. And so if you look at the people responsibility, this is really going to be a function of the identity and access management domain versus your SaaS application domain. And so what this does is this ultimately begs for a comprehensive organizational identity and access management strategy. And while data responsibility covers a huge cross-section of domains from data access and governance to privacy all the way to malware. So configuration for each of these is going to be extremely unique to each provider, and depending on what you're trying to do can be a full-time job. So as we look at the different the cloud provider responsibilities that are in blue, these are areas that traditional on-prem solutions you could control. So including, for example, like logging, network security, endpoint protection, so on and so forth. And that could be fed into solutions that would traditionally aid in disaster recovery and incident response. However, you don't get those types of logs from the providers typically. And so how are you going to implement an incident response environment in the cloud? And this is really where CASB solutions come into play. While they're not a substitution for a comprehensive cloud strategy, which we, from an Optus standpoint, we feel that helping our customers develop is going to be paramount, but these are also a tool to unify policies, visibility, access, and data classification, so on and so forth, across different cloud applications. And when we look at what is CASB, CASB provides visibility down to the data level and data flows between an organization's software-defined data center or their on-premise infrastructure and public cloud providers' infrastructure. So CASB acts as a gatekeeper, allowing the organizations to extend the reach of their security policies to the public cloud or SaaS applications that they're using. And historically, tools have lacked this visibility. So now that these tools exist, it allows an organization the ability to not only be proactive, but also have a remediation process in place that is a lot easier for a customer or an organization to really be able to implement. And so if we look at our approach, it's going to be really simple. It's more along the lines of business-aligned strategy. So very simply put, we help our organizations create a security program that enables their organization but understands multiple key points that they may be facing. So for example, such as business objectives, compliance objectives, along with threats or material risk. As we assist in creating this programmatic approach, we really help solve for both short-term tactical goals and long-term strategy goals an organization may have. So I'll give you an example. We've worked with a few customers when we're looking at SaaS, and we've asked them a question of how many SaaS applications do you have running that are sanctioned within your network? And we'll get a response anywhere from 50 to a couple of hundred applications that are running in their enterprise network. And as we've gone in and really taken a look at what SaaS applications are running, we've seen that the average enterprise has an upwards of 900 SaaS applications that are running. And so when we look at that, we're seeing about anywhere between 15 to 20% of those SaaS applications are actually sanctioned. So we're looking at quite a few SaaS applications that are unsanctioned. And the reason why I bring this proof point up is if we were to look at a scenario of just taking what is a short-term tactical goal and try to help them fix that, right, we could miss the broader spectrum of what does a long-term strategy goal look like. And as we uncover quite a few SaaS applications that are running within their network that are unsanctioned, it allows us to lasso those back in by utilizing the technology of these CASB tools to be able to help them understand from a user level of being able to define policies and controls around the user of what they may be able to use SaaS applications for, what data they're able to send. Do they have the ability to look at certain details of data if it's not part of their role and responsibility? So as you look at how we design an approach, right, we really want to look at the best technology for the use case. And many times, this is vetted out as we go through these types of approaches that are going to be business-led. So how can Optive help? So we focus on cloud development on agility and application-centric model. And what we really want to do is align cloud security strategy with the different business drivers and the risk tolerances that different organizations have. We do have a blueprint or a guideline that we typically follow. However, each customer is going to be completely different, and I'll give you an example of how. The diagram to the right shows cloud security in a circular motion. Any customer that we walk into, this can actually be completely different. Right? We can jump into where they already have a program governance in place, so they may not need a ton of help around that, but they may need help designing and engineering or even implementation of certain tools into their organization. So the way Optive helps is we have a full 360 program to not only help someone plan a solution, but we can also help them build one, and we can also help them cross that chasm and get them to the finish line and help them run that entire solution. So as we look at the CASB framework, right, Optive has 4 different pillars that we look at. We look at it from a visibility perspective, a compliance, data security, and threat protection. And as we look at this framework, it brings up some subpoints to help customers evaluate different portions of the SaaS landscape. It can be as simple as an API integration, but we can also get down into the different security analytics, the data loss that's involved, and then any type of encryption and tokenization. So as we have deeper conversations, it typically leads to how does an enterprise application integrate into their solution, right? Because every customer is going to have different enterprise applications, and how that integrates into their digital transformation journey is going to be completely different than the next person. And so we really want to understand from a holistic standpoint, from an evaluation standpoint, how can we help lasso all of these different points together to be able to build a rock-solid solution for an organization. So asking, why Optive for cloud security? Optive, we are extremely focused on security in the cloud for our customers. And we look at it from more of a implementation and a strategy, more so than just helping someone get something off the ground. So we have an extremely repeatable approach, and it's going to be specifically tailored to each one of our customers. And we look at it as no two customers are the same. They may have a few overlapping items, but no customer is going to be exactly the same as the next customer. And so we have the ability to collaborate across all of our different circles of excellence that we have within Optiv. And I'll give you an example of how. If you look at someone that is a cloud security engineer or a cloud security architect, to find that individual is extremely hard. But more importantly, being able to find an individual that has identity and access management background in the cloud, also has SaaS background, and then also any type of third-party risk or governance, right? That person you just simply can't find it in today's workforce. And so we are lucky enough to have over 1,000 security experts that work for Optiv, and each one of these experts have a domain within the cloud. So as we help organizations understand and really look at what their unique situation is and how do we help them cross that chasm and get them there, we are able to ride shotgun with organizations within Optiv that have cloud expertise in the different pillars, as I had mentioned before, such as identity and access management, third-party risk, governance, so on and so forth. And so our cloud security organization, we are able to harness the expertise that we have internally with each of these individual pillars and being able to create a rock-solid foundation for our customers. So moving forward, I'd like to introduce Eric Andrews. Eric, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Nick. That was a great overview on CASB technology. So for this next portion, I'm going to focus a little bit on what's next for CASB and where it's headed. So I'm going to explore some concepts I refer to as CASB 2.0, some interesting possibilities in terms of how CASB technology can integrate with other core security technologies. So as Nick pointed out, as we peel back the onion on a CASB architecture, there's many components that are involved to help deliver these services. So CASB is introducing a number of new control points, whether it be through APIs that connect into sanctioned applications like Office 365 or Google or Box, or we can use gateways that are sitting in line between the users and the cloud apps and help track information not only from sanctioned apps but also from unsanctioned apps. So it allows us to track a broader range of capabilities there. CASB solutions are also ingesting a number of events and log data from other security devices like firewalls and secure web gateways and so forth. All of this data is ingested into these CASB solutions to help analyze what's happening in the cloud. And that's the blind spot we're trying to address, is now giving enterprise organizations better visibility and control of everything happening in the cloud. And on the right-hand side, you'll see this raft of services that can now be applied. So in general, everything that you've thought of about security in the traditional sense is also needed in the cloud environment. So as we move our assets and data into the cloud, we need to make sure we cover all the bases, whether it's DLP or malware protection or whatnot. We need to make sure we cover all those bases as that activity moves into the cloud environment. And if I were to summarize some of the major components of a CASB solution, you have visibility. So how do I identify what applications and cloud services my users are going to? How risky are those cloud apps and services? Am I comfortable with that activity? Do I see some redundancy in use of cloud apps? So being able to get that visibility of what are people doing is certainly the first key thing people like to do. A second major pillar is data security and putting granular controls in place around sensitive content. So as content is flowing in and out of cloud apps, how do I identify sensitive content such as regulated data, PII, PCI, PHI, or source code? And how do I put restrictions around how that content is shared to make sure that nobody's inappropriately sharing that content outside of the company? So putting controls in place as well as tokenization and encryption, protecting my sensitive content. And the third major area that a lot of people focus on is threat protection. So now that I have my sensitive content out in third-party apps and services, and as Nick mentioned, it's a shared responsibility model with these vendors, these cloud app vendors, how do I make sure malicious actors aren't trying to access my data and hack into my accounts? And that requires some new tools that CASB helps provide to monitor that activity and look out for threatening activities. So these are some of the basic tenets of CASB technology. And I refer to that as sort of the first generation of CASB solutions. But what I'd like for this today is where does that go from here? And as we have been in this space for a long time, we recognize that there's a lot of obvious touch points with CASB technology and other core security technologies. You're looking at how do you interact with data loss prevention technologies? How do you interact with malware protection technologies? How do you interact with endpoint protection technologies? So there's a number of obvious touch points around this spectrum where we can gain a lot more value by taking the CASB technology and intelligently integrating it with a lot of its neighboring technologies to give it an even more powerful solution. And that's what we're referring to here as CASB 2.0, kind of the next frontier of where we drive CASB technology. So to illustrate this a little further, I'm going to take a look at 6 different use cases that help illuminate what's going on with CASB 2.0. So the first use case is, how can I automate control of shadow IT? So once again, the number of CASB solutions out there, ours included, will do a good job of helping you identify all the risky apps that people are using. But then what do you do next? What's the next step? How do you put controls in place and do something about that activity? The second use case I'll talk about is, how do I apply consistent DLP policies both for my on-prem environment as well as my cloud environment, and make sure that I have consistency in my compliance enforcement? The third use case we'll look at is, how can I make sure that encryption of my data is really an end-to-end solution, and I can control who has access regardless of where that data goes, certainly in the cloud, but also after it leaves the cloud. The fourth use case we'll look at is, what about malware? How do I actually understand what kind of malware might be existing in my cloud accounts and make sure that doesn't spread further? And then the fifth use case we'll touch on is, how can I dynamically adjust my authentication so that I can handle what's happening with risky transactions? So if my users are starting to get into more risky activity, I may want to step up authentication and provide more onerous requirements for them to get into the network if I know what they're doing is a risky transaction. And then finally, endpoint technology. How do I square my existing endpoint technology with cloud security, and how do I make the best use of both of those worlds? So these are some use cases that directly relate to how we can take CASB technology and intelligently integrate it with a number of portfolio technologies, including secure web gateway, DLP technology, encryption technology, malware protection, user authentication, and endpoint protection. So first off, we'll take a look at the controlling shadow IT. And this is where we can take advantage of having CASB intelligently integrate in with secure web gateway technology. As I mentioned, it's one thing to discover risky apps, but then what do you do about it? And the next step is not always straightforward or obvious. So one thing we can do is take that technology and integrate it with secure web gateway technology. So as a CASB solution, we have tens of thousands of applications that we've analyzed with lots of different metrics that help you understand what are all the apps out there, and that app landscape continues to grow and grow and grow. And how risky are those apps? Do they have the metrics that I care about as an organization? Well, I can take that database and automatically distribute it out to secure web gateway technologies that may be on-prem or in the cloud. Now that empowers the secure web gateway to have broader visibility of what's happening, not just a few hundred apps, but now they have access to tens of thousands of apps without having to add any hardware. So everything that's already existing can now just be more powerful. In addition, I go beyond just identifying risky apps. I can actually do something about it. So with a traditional solution, I may have to identify a risky app and then put a filter and a firewall to restrict use of that risky app, and then next week I find another risky app. So you have this game that I call whack-a-mole of constantly trying to find risky activity and then trying to constantly put filters in place to restrict that use case. Well, instead, with this type of seamless integration, I can add dynamic policies in place that operate on risk attributes. So if I decide, you know what, if an app has a business readiness rating lower than a certain threshold, I just don't want that app in my environment. Or if it's not SOC 2 compliant, I don't want it in my environment. When I start to use risk attributes, then my policies can continuously operate without having to be constantly updated. The back-end systems are going to update with new information as it finds new apps and automatically feed those policies. So as an operator, your life is greatly simplified. The other area that comes into integration as you deploy these technologies is how do I simplify deployment of both a CASB and a SWG? And you'll recognize as you start peeling back the onion, there's a lot of practical issues, like how do you steer traffic back and forth between one system and the other, or how do you share log data back and forth with one system and the other, or how do you make the user interfaces seamlessly work together. So by simplifying a lot of these deployment issues with automated log ingestion, unified authentication, integrated user interface, streamlined proxy chaining, you can make the deployment of both of these technologies a lot easier, again, reducing operational overhead. So let's take a look at DLP next. With DLP, I have a desire to have consistent policies work in my environment, both on-prem as well as in the cloud. So many people may have had DLP solutions in place already, and along comes the cloud, and they're deploying CASB solutions, which also have cloud DLP capabilities. So there's some DLP capabilities built into that as well. The challenge becomes, how do I make sure that these two systems are consistent? And I'm not having to constantly rewrite policies in the two environments, and I don't have a lot of redundancy and overhead in terms of a second team that's driving DLP the same as the first team. And this is a common problem that we've seen in our customer base. And some have suggested, well, perhaps we can use ICAP. You can take that cloud content, funnel it through an ICAP interface, and feed it into a DLP detection engine. And that way the same policies and incidents that you've defined on-prem are operating on all of your content, whether it's cloud or on-prem. Some obvious challenges with this is it's a huge waste of bandwidth. To be able to take all of that cloud content and funnel it back to my prem adds a lot of latency, consumes a lot of wasteful bandwidth. So it's really not very practical. In addition, the ICAP interface is not really designed to pass rich attributes back and forth. It's really just passing data back and forth. So when you get into a cloud environment, there's some new actions that you need to take advantage of. Like, for example, I may need to unshare a link as a consequence of identifying an incident. Well, you can't really do that through a standard ICAP interface. So again, if we look at a CASB 2.0 approach to this problem, what we can do is seamlessly integrate existing DLP technology into the cloud. We put the DLP detection in the cloud natively and have it sit adjacent with the CASB solution through a native RESTful API. What this allows us to do is maintain optimum performance. So all the content that's flowing in the cloud is analyzed in the cloud as well. I'm not shuttling traffic back and forth. I'm not wasting a lot of bandwidth. In addition, I am getting all of the existing policies and workflows to work as is. So that same DLP manager that sits on-prem can continue to be the brains of the operation, can continue to define the policies. We're just taking those and mapping them into the cloud environment so that now covers all of the content flowing into Office 365 or Box and so forth. So this becomes very powerful because I don't have to redo all of these policies, and I can continue to have that same DLP team drive the operation. And I also, since I'm using this native API between these systems, I can pass rich information back and forth. So that DLP operator now has the ability to add additional policies such as unshare a link or additional actions, as well as gain additional insights on their console. So the person looking at the DLP console can now see additional granular log data from what users are doing in the cloud or additional threat score information on individual users. So we can enrich the experience for the DLP console. So that's an example of how we can add a lot of value in the DLP scenario. Let's move along and take a look at encryption. If I look at encryption and tokenization, many CASB solutions have some basic form of encryption and tokenization capabilities, often encrypting data as it flows up into the cloud and then de-encrypting as it flows back down. But what happens after that content is downloaded? It could go in a lot of different directions. It could go to personal devices, a USB stick, or various other places. So you're still not out of the woods. So instead, with the CASB 2.0 approach, we can start to look at how we can do an end-to-end solution that continues to protect your data regardless of where it goes. As we see here, we have the ability to dynamically encrypt content that flows up that might hit a certain trigger, like it's sensitive content, it has PII or PCI or some other sensitive piece of content that we want to protect. So we can dynamically encrypt that data, and then as it's downloaded, instead of decrypting, let it download all the way to the endpoint. And then users have to authenticate themselves to be able to gain access to that content. So regardless of where that content goes, what device it gets passed on to, they have to basically phone home to be able to see what's in that piece of content. So that allows the organization to maintain control of who can see what. So it gives you total control regardless of where the data goes. And then that content is also beaconized and can be revoked at any time. So if you decide at a later point in time, you know what, this piece of content is no longer relevant, or I don't want it out in the public domain anymore, you can essentially digitally shred that file and revoke access, and no matter how many copies are floating around, it's gone. So this gives you a lot more control end-to-end in terms of protecting your data, and delivers really a comprehensive information rights management solution. So now let's take a look at malware and what can we do about applying malware detection and protection in your cloud environment. So there's many advanced solutions out there for malware protection. Obviously, it's one of the cornerstones of security framework in general. But not all of these have the ability to see what's going on in cloud accounts and cloud activity. As I mentioned earlier, CASBs have a lot of value in providing new control points and touch points to help you see content flowing in and out of cloud apps. And this is important because, content's not necessarily flowing all the time from your organization's enterprise into the cloud. It's also going cloud to cloud. You can have files and content coming from one box account to another box account without ever touching anything in your enterprise architecture, which means it's probably bypassing any kind of malware protection solution you may have deployed. So the fluidity of data in a cloud environment makes it a little tricky in terms of applying best-of-breed malware. You can also create content natively within these cloud apps as well. So there's a need to figure out how to track this content. It's also particularly concerning because a lot of users like to sync and share their environment. So if I have my work computer, I may sync and share that to my box account. It's a corporate box account so that all of my files stay in sync. Well, if I happen to walk in with some malware on my machine, then all of a sudden that can wind up infecting the box account, which can rapidly spread to many other users in the organization. So the sync and share phenomena of cloud can lead to a viral spreading of malware as well. So what can we do about it? Obviously, in a CASB 2.0 approach, we want to take your best-of-breed malware analysis and detection technology and seamlessly integrate it with CASB technology. So we can For example, leverage the vast threat intelligence database. Here at Symantec, we've got one of the world's largest databases of threat intel. Why not use that to analyze everything that's flowing in and out of the cloud apps? We can do file reputation analysis and so forth. Leveraging classic AV scanning technologies to make sure we're doing a thorough scrubbing of any content flowing in and out of cloud apps, whether cloud to cloud or user to cloud, as well as looking out for advanced persistent threats and sandboxing technologies to make sure that we really apply the most modern available technologies we have to all the content flowing in and out of the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, every security technology that you've ever deployed needs to figure out how to apply to a cloud environment as well, because that's where most of the data is going over time. So let's take a look at user authentication and what we can do for these environments. So most CASB solutions today will have basic integration with the user authentication systems, and we do as well. Typically, these are done with SAML integration. So if you're linking in with any sort of single sign-on vendors, for example, on Okta or Ping or OneLogin or various other tools out there, or Symantec's VIP, you can use SAML integration to make sure that you have some consistency in that approach. But what we can explore in a CASB 2.0 environment is how do we harness the rich data that we have in the CASB solution to feed back into the user authentication solution and perhaps do some more intelligent things. For example, as a CASB solution, I happen to know that a user may be particularly risky. Maybe his threat score has ratcheted up because he's done a number of suspicious actions that lead me to be concerned about who that user is and whether they might be some sort of malicious actor masquerading as one of my end users. Well, I can use that information to feed back to the user authentication system and say, you know what, if this user's score, threat score, is above a certain threshold, I want you to step up and use multi-factor authentication so I can, make some more onerous requirements on that user to get into my system. Similarly, I might have a requirement that, if you're trying to touch some very sensitive data like my corporate source code or PII information, I may trigger some additional authentication steps for you to be able to touch that. Or even more, I can define any combination of transactional details that I decide look like risky activity and ratchet up the authentication requirements for you to proceed. So what we're really doing is making a very dynamic environment where the authentication requirements are dynamically stepping up as the risk level steps up in the environment. And that can all happen automatically. Finally, let's take a look at endpoint protection. So as we peel back the onion on CASB models, as we discussed earlier, there's a number of different touch points with gateways and APIs and log data and so forth. And one of the components that's often used in a CASB environment is the API or the agent. And an agent helps steer traffic towards the gateway, helps with enforcement of policies, and gives you a little bit more control. Well, as we step into a lot of existing environments, we realize, well, they have a lot of times already deployed agent technology throughout their environment. And sometimes they're a little reluctant to deploy yet another agent. So how can we streamline this process and make it more efficient for organizations? Well, one obvious touch point is, hey, we can consolidate all of that so that your existing endpoint agent platform can absorb CASB endpoint technology, therefore reducing the number of agents you have to deploy and making it simpler in terms of operational overhead. And then your entire footprint of existing agents can all of a sudden become CASB enabled. So that's one obvious simplification that can be done. Another interesting simplification that we can do is helping to streamline and improve your efficacy of shadow IT analysis. So as I mentioned, with shadow IT analysis, we're typically taking log data from secure web gateways or firewalls to understand what cloud apps and services people are going to. Well, there's one common denominator with that data, and that is it's all coming from a corporate environment. What happens when the user leaves that corporate environment and does some work from a coffee shop or from their home or from a remote office? That might become a blind spot now in our shadow IT analysis. But if we take the telemetry from endpoint agents and feed that into our shadow IT analysis, we can now improve our visibility and understand the shadow IT environment, not just for on-prem traffic, but also off-prem traffic. So those are some examples of how we can add value by seamlessly integrating CASB with endpoint technology as well. So as perhaps a 2-minute commercial here on Symantec, we've been focused on cloud security for some time on a number of technologies. Our Cloud SOC platform is really a best-of-breed CASB platform. It came in through the acquisition of Elastica and Blue Coat into the Symantec family. And we perform a number of these core capabilities with CASB shadow IT analysis, APIs, gateways, tokenization, and encryption. We have advanced user behavior analytics and a number of other unique tools to help deliver excellent cloud security. And we've also been at the forefront of this CASB 2.0 idea and seamlessly integrating this technology with a number of core technologies like web security, DLP, endpoint security, advanced malware analysis, encryption, and so forth. So this is something we've been very focused on and continue to want to lead the way with and help make a better end-to-end solution for end customers. A number of the analysts out there have also been starting to take notice, obviously, of CASB. It's been a very talked about space, and have started to do head-to-head comparisons of this technology as well. So we were very happy when Forrester was the first major analyst vendor to come out with an analysis of CASB solutions, and we came out on top of that analysis. And I'll note that that was actually before we did all this cool integration, this kind of CASB 2.0 stuff with the Symantec portfolio technology. So we have much more interesting things to offer now than we did even back then. So that's sort of a summary of the concept of CASB 2.0. Hopefully it piqued your interest in some of the possibilities of what can be done when we take this CASB technology and more intelligently integrate it with a lot of the neighboring technologies around it to provide really 3 things. 1, increase your security efficacy, catching more incidents, making sure nothing falls through the cracks as it flows between these different tools. 2 is reducing your operational expenses and overhead, helping you save money essentially. And 3 is improving the user experience, both for administrators as well as for end users using your network. So that's a summary of my session, and with that, I'll pass it back to Courtney.
Thanks, Rick, and thank you, everyone. That concludes today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed the presentations. If you have any questions, there will be a Q&A box on your dashboard for you to submit your inquiries. In addition, a follow-up email will be sent to you shortly, which will include links to review today's webinar recording, download assets, and retrieve contact info should you have any additional questions afterwards. Thanks again, and have a great day.